So what I'm going to talk about today is this started out as a commission from the Ontario Problem Gambling Research Centre as well as the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care back in 2007, where they wanted to know what was the existing evidence on the best ways to mitigate the harm associated with problem gambling. So back in 2007, and actually in that particular book there that I put out a chapter that summarized the evidence on all the different initiatives around the world that have been, actually it's in the other book. So, yeah.
This is my Bible, I love it.
So this was the first iteration, was a chapter in there. And it was very well received, and so I got another commission to update it 2 years later, and then a third commission, and that what the final one is the latest version of this. That's right. Yeah. So what this is the most comprehensive identification of all the initiatives being used in problem gambling around the world and what's known about the effectiveness. It's 500 studies, and it's basically an exhaustive compendium of everything you want to know about it. So that makes it very challenging to talk about what all these initiatives are and how effective they are in 30 minutes or 40 minutes. But that's what I'm going to try to do. This is a bit of a whirlwind. What it is a identification of the type of initiative and roughly what we know about its efficacy. My colleagues on this were Bev West, former research associate with me at U of L, and Rob Simpson, the former CEO of OPGRC. So this presentation is divided in two major sections: educational initiatives and policy initiatives. So educational initiatives defined as things trying to improve people's knowledge or awareness of gambling so as to make them less likely to engage in it in the first place, or if they do engage in it, less likely to progress to problem gambling. So it's really educating the gambler as a way of preventing harm. The second larger section is on policy initiatives, changing the way in which gambling is provided, either its availability or how it's actually, specific parameters of how it's provided, etc. So, but this first section is on educational initiatives, and the most common educational initiative worldwide is what I'll call information or awareness campaigns. And you guys do some of that here at the Foundation as well. It's the most omnipresent type of initiative. It's things like media campaigns or websites or information on a lottery ticket. Basically, admonishing people to know their limits or to gamble responsibly, or dispelling common gambling fallacies or signs and symptoms of problem gambling. Various manifestations of this, but it's generally a large-scale educational approach for the general population. So what do we know about the effectiveness of these strategies? Essentially mixed results. Again, what you're going to find with prevention initiatives in gambling is the amount of research on the efficacy of each of these initiatives is small compared to other fields like alcohol, safe sex, seat belts, tobacco. But that we have many analogs in other fields, like those ones I just mentioned, to guide what is likely to occur for gambling. But specific to gambling, what we know is the few evaluations that have occurred have showed mixed results, showing these messages can temporarily improve knowledge and change attitudes. However, the problem is that the studies show that most people don't attend to them. We're bombarded with a lot of information out there, on the news and television, radio, and we tend to tune out. The second problem is that the actual effect on gambling behavior is unknown. However, again, we have this huge literature in analog fields that shows that information campaigns for whatever behavior you're trying to modify, behavioral change is actually very uncommon, and only occurs if the information is personally relevant to you, if the behavior is easy to change and the consequences of not changing are significant. So these are classic examples where information campaigns actually have changed population behavior. So alerting people to get their cholesterol tested because it might be related to heart disease. That actually did cause a significant uptake in people seeking out their physicians for that. The relationship between sodium and, again, heart disease, that actually resulted in in information campaigns on that topic caused a significant reduction in sodium intake in North America. HIV testing is another thing that had immediate behavioral effects on the population. But those are the exceptions. Most information campaigns, most of the time, don't generally have wide-scale, significant behavioral impacts. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing them. I still think they provide the intellectual context for the changes that do occur, that unless you know why you should be changing, you're not going to change. But it's very clear, as an initiative in and of itself, it's not particularly powerful. And that's a bit discouraging, because this is, in fact, one of the most common initiatives. Now, another initiative that's a very interesting one are on-site information or counseling centers. Sometimes called RGICs, Responsible Gambling Information Centers. This is where you receive information about gambling, problem gambling, and or referral to actual provision or counseling. I believe the Crown Casino in Victoria is one of the very first places in the world to institute something like this, and it's now been adopted in several other countries. So it makes sense that you go to where the gamblers are, particularly the problem gamblers, and a lot of them are in casinos. And so this is a more targeted intervention. So theoretically, this should have more of an impact than a wide-scale primary prevention approach where we're trying to alert everyone. So what do we know about the effectiveness? What we know, here again, we've only got a few evaluation studies, but what we know is that very high patron awareness. If you ask people who go into the casino, do they know about these things? Most of them say yes. But very low utilization. So what we know is that between 2005 2009 in Ontario, there were 200 million customers to the casinos there, but only 61,000 people visited one of these RGICs. Similarly, in Manitoba, and we've got recent data for Alberta as well. I haven't seen data for the Crown Casino, but my guess is it's probably pretty similar. That just because it's there doesn't mean people are utilizing it. I mean, certainly we know that there should be an awful lot more people who could benefit from accessing these centers than that are actually doing it. And furthermore, the people who do go there, they're mostly receiving information about problem gambling and making treatment referrals. They're not, for the most part, providing interventions. So the problem with that is that there's very low follow-up on these treatment referrals and no actual impact on gambling behavior, so that jurisdictions that have introduced these RGICs have not seen an uptake in the numbers of people accessing treatment in those jurisdictions, as you might expect if these places are a funnel to that. So this is an idea that makes a lot of theoretical sense, but there's not a lot of evidence that they're really having an impact. School-based statistical instruction. The notion here is that if you truly understood the negative mathematical expectation associated with gambling activity, you wouldn't gamble in the first place. So surely, if you taught people in school about the mathematics underlying traditional gambling games, they'd be more inoculated to gambling in the first place and developing problem gambling. In several studies of this, again, with surprisingly mixed results. That here again, we have a reliable impact on knowledge and gambling fallacies, but inconsistent impacts on subsequent gambling behavior. One of the classic studies on this was one I conducted at University of Lethbridge with the mathematics department. So we turned introductory probability, that course, into introductory probability with a gambling focus. So all of the examples were gambling based, all the labs, we had roulette wheels and blackjack. My graduate student at the time was a dealer at a local casino, and so the students would come in for the labs and she'd clean them out with fake money. Every lab, just to show the negative mathematical expectations, and you got tested on this. Your test on probability theory for this half-year course was based on your understanding of the odds associated with all the different gambling games. So a very heavy-duty intervention. So surely, when you follow these students up 6 months later, they'd be gambling less, or maybe at least they'd be gambling on, things like blackjack with better odds than lottery tickets. But there's actually no impact whatsoever on behavior. In fact, there's a negative correlation between marking the course and problem gambling status. And it took me months to figure out why that was. It took me months, but it turned out it was because the best students in the course tend to be of Asian heritage, but they were also most likely to be problem gamblers. But very useful lesson there. It shows that culture trumps academic knowledge. So, disappointing. But this is important to recognize, that simply making people more statistically fluent, knowing something and doing something are two different things. Any of us work in addiction know that's the case. So what about more comprehensive school-based prevention programs? Now, there's been several of those. I don't know if Don't Bet On It's still being implemented in South Australia, but Australia is actually one of the first jurisdictions to start putting these in place. I don't know if anything exists. It doesn't sound like anything exists in Victoria, but there's been a few. One I developed in Alberta is actually being used all through North Carolina, New York, and now Ohio. And so what do we know about the effectiveness of these things? Well, first of all, these essentially are more broad-based sort of things. Yes, the statistical knowledge is part of it, but it's not the main part or the exclusive part. So the addictive nature of gambling, building self-esteem, peer resistance skills, some of the same elements you generally have in prevention programs for other sorts of potentially dangerous behavior. A broad-based and multi-session initiative. So what do you know about the effectiveness? Only 4 empirical studies, reliable impacts on knowledge and gambling fallacies, inconsistent impacts on behavior. Stack Deck is the only program actually to achieve a behavioral change, and even there, I mean, Stack Deck is 500 minutes of instruction. It's a very heavy duty. It's like every day for 5 days, and then a booster session a couple of weeks later. Even that, the magnitude of the impact was fairly small. So here again, even though these things make theoretical sense, that the impacts on reducing gambling-related harm are small or non-existent. Now, this is not much different from what we find for smoking prevention programs or illicit drug use programs. Again, it's very hard to have a significant behavioral effect when you do these things in the school. All right, so that's the educational initiatives. And while these things should still be done, it's clear they're not sufficient on their own, and they're not amongst the more powerful means to reduce gambling-related harm. Now we're going to talk about some things that actually have a little more of an impact. So the first subcategory is restrictions on the general availability of gambling. So one initiative could be restricting the number of gambling venues. So this strategy has good support by virtue of the positive correlation between local problem gambling rates and proximity to gambling venues. That's been demonstrated in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US. The closer you are to a gambling venue, the more likely your problem gambling prevalence rate is going to be higher. This shows the Canadian data, and this is the provincial problem gambling prevalence rate in the last national survey, where each of the provinces' problem gambling prevalence rate was assessed as a function of venues per capita. And you'll notice that casinos was quite significant, but many of these others weren't. In fact, there was no relationship between number of EGM venues per capita and problem gambling rates. In fact, there's a negative one associated with lottery outlets. There's a complex reason about why that is. But the general point that if you have casinos, the number of casinos you have per capita is related to problem gambling. That's a very robust finding. Similarly, another way of addressing this question is before-after comparisons of problem gambling rates subsequent to the introduction of a new gambling venue. Usually you find significant increases. That I've done these studies in British Columbia, and again, 3 of the 4 communities had a significant introduction. Most of the socioeconomic impact studies that have done this have found significant increases in problem gambling subsequent to introduction. So the general point is that restricting the number of gambling venues from a theoretical perspective and indirect empirical perspective is probably one of the better, more powerful techniques to reduce problem gambling. It's no panacea. It's not like problem gambling is going to go away. The reality is that we suspect that problem gambling rates in North America before legalized gambling were still 50% of the current rates. So we had problem gambling long before we had legalized gambling. The availability of legalized gambling has exacerbated that rate, but the reality is that eliminating all that legalized gambling, you're still going to have a significant amount of problem gambling. Another strategy is restricting the more harmful types of gambling. So it's kind of peculiar that in gambling that most fields governments restrict more intrinsically harmful forms of a product, so that methamphetamine and heroin are not legally available, but other prescription drugs and alcohol are, with the notion being that some things are really intrinsically more dangerous. It's more difficult to buy automatic weapons as opposed to hunting rifles. But the strange thing with gambling is that even though there's a clear hierarchy of harm, even though we know that in most Western countries, EGMs, casino table games, and internet gambling are statistically associated with problem gambling to a much greater extent, and those are the problems people are talking about in their treatment centers. These things are just as prevalent and available as the more benign forms, such as lottery tickets or bingo or other things. So, furthermore, there is a strong relationship between EGMs per capita and problem gambling rates within countries. So, in both the last national study in Australia and the last national study in Canada, there was a very strong positive relationship. Interestingly, there's no correlation, a lot of people don't realize this, but there's no correlation in problem gambling rates worldwide as a function of EGMs per country. And the reason for that, there's two reasons for that. One is that the highest standardized problem gambling rates in the world tend to be in Asian countries. So Hong Kong, Singapore, Macau are countries which have significantly higher rates than most of the rest of the world, and yet they have very few, in some of those jurisdictions, zero EGMs, because most of the problem gambling there is associated with baccarat and casino table games. So we've demonized EGMs in Western countries. We've got to realize that casino table games are much more problematic in Asian countries. Now, the other reason for that is that Europe has a very high density of EGMs, and they're found in convenience locations, restaurants, gas stations, et cetera, but they're low stakes, low prize, and so they're not the same sort of EGMs you find in the local casinos in Australia. So worldwide, there's actually no correlation. But it's clear that if you standardize, if you're looking at a single demographic like all of Australia or all of Canada and the single type of machine, there's a clear association there. Now, modest EGM reductions have not produced much effect on problem gambling. That's been demonstrated here in Victoria, South Australia, Nova Scotia. However, total EGM elimination has occurred in South Dakota, South Carolina, and Norway did unambiguously reduce problem gambling rates. So generally what you're going to find is that one of these trends is that when initiatives that have potential to work are implemented, they're done in such a small way, inconsequential way, that they don't really inconvenience people, and so you shouldn't really expect that there's going to be a significant reduction. But it's clear if you do eliminate this form, like Norway, for example, when they had this temporary interruption, there was no EGMs at all for about a year. Their number of helpline calls dropped to like 42 in an entire year for the entire country, from thousands in the previous years. Now, other evidence is that the worldwide prevalence of internet problem gambling is directly related to its legal availability. So the UK has the highest rate, has one of the most permissive legislative schemes around internet gambling. Pretty much anything goes. They also have the world's highest rate of internet gambling and internet problem gambling. So legal availability of these more harmful types of products seems pretty clearly related to greater problems in the population. So restricting more harmful types of gambling, that makes sense in the drug field, it makes sense in firearms field, it makes sense in gambling field, and yet very few countries have implemented this. Restricting the number of gambling formats. This is actually one of the strongest correlations. Those of you who work in treatment know that problem gamblers tend to be very versatile. It's like alcoholics might have a preferable type of alcoholic beverage, but they drink everything. Similarly for problem gamblers, they may lose more money on EGMs, but they tend to play a lot of different things. And this versatility might be a bit of a problem. That the strongest individual correlation between problem gambling propensity is not the type of gambling you're involved in, although that's quite strong if it's EGMs. It's actually the number of different gambling formats you engage in. And so if we restricted the range, that theoretically that should have an impact. No empirical evidence one way or the other on this, but it's something that has some theoretical cogency. Limiting gambling to gambling venues, something that makes a lot of theoretical sense, that people have to make a deliberate decision to go gambling. That's going to be better than if they just walk into a bar and there's EGMs omnipresent. Theoretically sensible, but actually lacks empirical support, surprisingly. In Canada, there's no relationship between the number of EGM locations per capita and provincial problem gambling rates. So in Canada, we have 2 provinces, British Columbia and Ontario, where EGMs are not available outside of casinos. And all the other provinces, you'll find EGMs in all the bars. And yet the problem gambling rates are equivalent across all provinces. Similarly, in the U.S., there's no significant difference in problem gambling prevalence in the 5 states with EGMs outside of gambling venues versus the states that only have EGMs within dedicated gambling venues. In Europe, EGMs are found in a much greater, the accessibility to EGMs is much higher in Europe, but Europe tends to have lower rates of problem gambling. Now, part of the explanation here is that there's some compensation. That jurisdictions with this policy tend to increase the number of dedicated gambling venues to compensate. So France has 197 casinos. So these are really just bars with a few slot machines in. They call them casinos. And it's no coincidence that Ontario and British Columbia were the 2 provinces that chose, take the principled path and only have dedicated gambling venues. That's because 90% of the population in those 2 provinces are found in a very circumscribed area. In places like Alberta or Saskatchewan, where the population is much more dispersed, that's why they couldn't restrict it just to gambling venues. So I don't know what the situation here is for Australia, but this might be part of the explanation why this theoretically sensible policy lacks empirical support. Restricting the location of gambling venues. Now, this is a very important one because individual vulnerability is actually one of the most powerful predictors of problem gambling. Now, this is one thing the industry has been talking about, and it's one of the things that the industry has right, that gambling availability increases the propensity for someone to become a problem gambler, but without that, without some family history and or genetic predisposition, most people, many people have been to casinos, but only a small portion develop problems. The reality is that research in all addiction fields show that 50% of the propensity for developing an addiction, doesn't matter if we're talking about tobacco, alcohol, or gambling, is genetic. Now, people working in treatment often have a hard time believing that or understanding that, but that's the truth. It may be indirectly through inheriting personality characteristics like impulsivity or risk-taking, but the reality is that individual propensity for addiction is a very strong predictor of whether you're going to have higher rates of addiction in a jurisdiction. This is why, historically, casinos were always kept to urban centers. It's a very peculiar thing to put a casino in an urban center. You always put them in resorts where you're going to access tourist money. So this, what we have today in most Western countries, is a historical anomaly. And furthermore, worldwide problem gambling is more often found in poorer neighborhoods, although poverty may not be the relevant correlate. In Canada, one of the strongest correlation I've ever found between problem gambling rates and demographic features is that the proportion of the provincial population with Aboriginal ancestry almost correlates perfectly with problem gambling prevalence rates per province. Indigenous people worldwide have much higher rates and propensities. It may not have to do with genetics, it may have to do with the adverse environmental circumstances in which they live that make them more vulnerable to these potential addictive behaviors. But the main point here is that restricting, being careful about where you put these things is a very important policy initiative that has a lot of theoretical sense. Limiting gambling venue hours, common policy in some countries, has very good support in the alcohol policy field. Now, reductions in hours in jurisdictions have done this. Nova Scotia, Australia has had modest effects, again, because the magnitude of the restriction is very small. You know, shutting machines down from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. That's still a good policy because that probably does preferentially target problem gamblers, but it's not enough of a reduction to really have a jurisdiction-wide impact in problem gambling prevalence rates. But again, this has good support in the alcohol field, and a more substantive type of intervention probably does make theoretical sense for gambling. Now, another general category of policy initiatives are restrictions on who can gamble. Now, this is the interesting thing, that everything's on the table here. We need to examine everything. So prohibition of youth gambling, in fact, is probably the most common policy worldwide to mitigate the harm. And actually, I don't think this is a good thing. Why? Well, let me give you some background here. Despite almost worldwide underage prohibition, underage youth still may have significant rates of problem gambling. Countries with permissive attitudes towards youth gambling, the UK, kids can still gamble on slot machines, one of the few countries in the world where you can go to any seaside resort and kids can gamble on slot machines. But the UK, compared to Australia or Canada or a lot of other Western countries, has lower rates of problem gambling compared to us. So could this early exposure actually have beneficial effects? It evokes the association we know with early exposure to alcohol in Southern European countries and China and Israel with lower rates of adult problem gambling, adult alcoholism. So what's going on here? So there are important lessons from the alcohol field. Now, we do know that there's a lot of countries, Southern Europe, Israel, China being good examples, where children are introduced to alcohol at a very early stage. But there's other countries, France, and most indigenous populations where that's also the case, and yet they have particularly higher rates of alcohol abuse, and these have low rates. What differentiates these guys from these guys is early exposure in the context of extended modeling of appropriate use. Now, the example I like to give is my daughter Hillary, when she turned 14. We have one of the youngest driving ages in the world in Alberta, and I was pretty upset when she told me she was going for a driving license at age 14. But I did the research on this, and in Alberta, you can't drive independently till you're 16. So she had to listen to me criticize her driving for 2 years before she could drive independently. And the proof's in the pudding. The rates of accidents associated with youth in Alberta is significantly lower than most other jurisdictions. So the idea here is extended modeling. This is why we have graduated licenses for cars. It works. This is why early exposure in family contexts, having one glass of wine with dinner, or religious contexts, and not modeling drunkenness actually has good prophylactic effects on people when they're older. So why aren't we doing the same thing with gambling? The reality is, it's no surprise that 18 to 25-year-olds worldwide have the highest rates of problem gambling when they get no modeling whatsoever. And then as soon as they turn 18, anything goes. The reality is we should, in fact, be exposing kids in a modeled way to gambling early on to have more of a preventative effect on their susceptibility later on. If you don't want to do that, then at least raise the legal age. That, again, this has good support in the alcohol field, that states that raise the legal age for alcohol from 18 to 21 has significant reductions in fatal road accidents associated with alcohol. The legal age in the world varies from 16 to 25, depending on the jurisdiction, type of gambling. If we move that up, I mean, of course, people are still going to gamble regardless of the legal age, but it actually does have a preventative effect. You have fewer people than you would otherwise. So again, unambiguous evidence in the alcohol field, this is useful. Very few empirical studies in gambling, but in Norway they found a significant decrease in EGM use when legal age increased from 16 to 18. So this makes sense if we don't want to do the better policy, which is graduated exposure in a modeled way to gambling for youth. Restricting venue entry to non-residents. Now, that's never going to happen. Well, actually, it is happening in Australia. I'll explain that in a minute, with online casinos. But historically, this is a very common policy. Most European countries, when they introduced gambling, would only allow tourists to access the casinos. And makes a lot of sense economically, because then the wealth is a true influx of wealth rather than redistribution from the existing population. And furthermore, the harms go home with the tourists rather than impacting your local population. So there's only a few countries in the world now that do that. I can't remember the current situation of online casinos in Australia, but it was a very interesting policy when Australia came out with this policy that online casinos operated on Australian soil. You could only be a foreign resident to access them. A lot of us saw that as pretty Machiavellian policy, but a very sensible policy from both a harm reduction and an economic perspective. So again, this is more of academic interest, and this policy not likely to be implemented in most Western countries. But what do we know about the effectiveness? Theoretically sound, very little evidence. However, casino gambling is uncommon in South Korea. Did a prevalence study there a couple of years ago, and the rates of problem gambling, it's the one Asian country with unusually low rates. Rates of problem gambling there are 0.8%, very, very low. And it's because they have no casinos except for one, which is many hours away and it's hard to get to. This lack of access to EGMs and casino table games does seem to translate into a significantly lower rate. Again, a sensible, theoretically sensible policy, but a bit of a political minefield if you ever wanted to do something like that. Restricting venue entry to higher socioeconomic groups. So that's operationalized in different ways through dress codes in Europe, income tests in these countries, significant entrance fees in these countries. Here in Australia or Canada, we really don't have any of this type of initiative. The effectiveness of doing this is unknown, although low income is a reliable predictor of problem gambling status in Western countries. So again, something may not be politically palatable anyways, but the real question from a scientific standpoint is, does it work? And we just don't know. But theoretically, it might have a benefit. Final category is restrictions on how gambling is provided. Oops. One of the most common interventions here are modifying EGM parameters. So almost everything under the sun here has been modified. The speed of the machines, the frequency of near misses, the number of play lines, whether you have bill acceptors or not, minimum, maximum bet size, maximum win size, whether the machines are interactive, whether you have pop-up messages and whether they're dynamic or static, whether you have a clock on there, where you have a mandatory cash out, payback percentage, how private the machine is, using money versus credits, lights and sounds, seating subs, but actually been a lot of research in this area. So we can say something a little more definitively here. Research shows some utility for eliminating early big wins, reducing near misses, having a slower speed machine, having dynamic pop-up messages, a lower maximum bet size, fewer betting lines, and limiting bill acceptors. The fly in the ointment here is that the magnitude of the effect is small, especially for problem gamblers. To me, this is always seen very analogous to our attempts to reduce the harm associated with tobacco. Let's put filters on these things. And then 10 years later, well, let's introduce low tar varieties. The reality is these things really didn't have much impact. And to me, that's what this is about. EGMs are inherently, any device with a frequency of 6 seconds per game, it's essentially you're offering a lottery every 6 seconds, and you can bet up to $250 on your lottery ticket. These are inherently risky devices. And such from a behavioral perspective, the opportunity of partial reinforcement effect, and furthermore, these things have been evolved. I mean, these machines have been around 100 years now, and what happens in the venues is the machines that are not making money get thrown out, machines that are making money get expanded, and so you have evolution of machines with more efficient features to extract money. So it's no surprise these are the most revenue generating machines, and also the machines with the highest addiction potential. So I don't think we can really minimize the harm of these things unless there was a fairly fundamental change in how they worked. Player pre-commitment. So as you know, some EGMs, internet gambling sites, allow gamblers to establish time or spending limits. What's clear is the research shows very low utilization of pre-commitment when it's not mandatory. So in Nova Scotia, they implemented pre-commitment on their machines. Only 2% of people access that. And I know this is a relevant debate here in Australia, but the research is pretty clear that if you make it voluntary, only a small portion will access that, and it's not really the portion you want. Even when mandatory, limited effectiveness when limits are easily revocable. Limited effectiveness, other opportunities available. There's other EGMs with these features on, or you have internet sites that do not require pre-commitment. I mean, you have 2,000 online gambling sites, and so simply having one responsible site doesn't stop the gambling. People just have 1,999 other sites to go to. And limited effectiveness if you can use other people's IDs. So card swapping is common, like in Nova Scotia, again, was the classic example. They just borrowed other people's cards. And so unless you have biometric or facial identification, that pre-commitment, again, while theoretically sensible, the devil's in the details. If it's mandatory and if you restrict opportunities for getting around the system, then I think it probably would work. Otherwise, I think it's largely window dressing. Elimination of player reward loyalty programs. Heavy gamblers are most likely to access loyalty programs. And anecdotally appears to encourage excessive expenditure. Unclear why these exist at all in jurisdictions with a single gambling provider. Now, this is an interesting one, that public would generally not accept programs that incentivize increased alcohol or tobacco consumption. Now, Australia is a peculiar exception to that. Like in Canada and North America, Canada or United States, generally, you can't incentivize alcohol purchase. So I find it very peculiar here. You buy a case of beer and you get the next case for half price, or you have various incentive schemes for rewarding consumption. And that's not a very responsible policy, to my mind. Most countries, most Western countries, don't allow that. And they certainly wouldn't allow that for tobacco consumption. You get a reduced, after your fifth drink, you buy 5 drinks, your sixth is half price. It just doesn't make sense that you incentivize consumption. Pharmacies in North America prohibit reward programs, so you can't. The more prescription drugs you buy, you can't get reward points for that. So it's unclear why we're rewarding gambling consumption. What you should do is reward responsible gambling. So Massachusetts will be the first jurisdiction in the world where you can use your player card, but after you spend $400, you collect no more points. And in fact, there's some suggestion that we might implement it such that if you start to spend $800, you start losing your reward points. So here you're rewarding responsible gambling. If you can have these reward cards, then change the parameters so they actually have some potential impact. Operator-imposed maximum loss limits exist on some government-operated online sites. In Norway, implementation is associated with lower gambling revenue. That's a very unusual policy that you can actually, the government restricts how much you can actually spend. Norway is really one of the few jurisdictions in the world where that exists. New Zealand Lottery is the other one. But it's clear that this works. Now, obviously it's going to be associated with lower gambling revenue, but there's dramatically lower helpline calls for slot machines when this limit on how much you could spend every month was put in place. Now, there was no overall decrease in problem gambling, but it was actually quite low to begin with, so maybe you have a bit of a... it's hard to totally eliminate problem gambling. Again, this is not something that's likely to be implemented in other countries, but it's clear that this seems to be an effective policy. Employee problem gambling awareness training, very common worldwide, and I know it's done here as well. The few satisfactory knowledge evaluations are very positive. However, in the alcohol field, where this has been evaluated very extensively, the training of alcohol servers has mixed behavioral effects due to the conflicts with profits and due to the lack of enforcement and personal drinking habits which are inconsistent with the policy. So research has shown that gaming employees tend to have higher rates of problem gambling. They're attracted to the gambling venue. That's partly why they want to work there. And so they see it as a bit hypocritical to mitigate other people's excessive gambling when they themselves tend to gamble excessively. No, most gaming employees aren't problem gamblers, but there's a much higher rate of gambling amongst gaming employees. So this should still be done, but we know that this has fairly small impacts in the alcohol field. Automated intervention for at-risk gamblers. So, for example, in Netherlands, that when you have to show your ID to enter, as is the case for most countries in the world, Australia, Canada, Macau, United States being the exceptions, that if a certain level of visitation occurs, you're automatically approached, asked to whether you want to sign a visit limitation contract or a self-exclusion contract. Another version of this is risky bank gambling patterns in your player card is used to alert staff in Saskatchewan, Sky City Casino in New Zealand, or the actual player. So when you're using your card in Sweden, PlayScan is the operator there. That it sends you an email message saying your behavior is risky, or it's at the yellow level. You should be concerned about this. What do we know about the effectiveness of this initiative? Positive behavioral results, more so for direct player alerts. So the PlayScan system in Sweden works. And it's always much easier to nip a problem in the bud before it's full blown. So this makes theoretical sense, and it's something we should be doing. Restricting access to money, house credits banned throughout Europe, Australia, Canada. US is the only country with common. ATMs typically permitted at gambling venues, that being the case. Theoretically sensible is ATM use much higher for problem gamblers. Problem gamblers often report restrict ATM would be very useful. There's only been one empirical study. Anna Thomas actually presented this at the New Zealand conference, and it showed clear beneficial behavioral effects. So it's clear that if you restrict access to money for problem gamblers, or to gamblers more generally, this will have beneficial behavioral effects at reducing the harm. Restrictions on concurrent use of alcohol and tobacco. I don't know what the situation here is in Australia, but it's clear that problem gamblers tend to have higher rates of smoking and higher rates of alcohol use, and if you allow that, and if you in fact subsidize that with low-cost alcohol, you're probably contributing to the problem. The evidence of this initiative is seen indirectly in the fact that most jurisdictions of the world have now prevented smoking within all establishments, and that revenues drop significantly pretty much in every jurisdiction in the world where smoking bans are implemented. Now, I've often said that's probably one of the best problem gambling interventions that ever occurred, even though that wasn't the intent, because it more directly impacted problem gamblers, 70% of which are smokers, as opposed to like 15-20% of recreational gamblers. So that reduction in revenue is probably very good. Puzzle concerning the mechanism by which the revenue has recovered. Jurisdictions with this have now seen the revenues come back to what they were before. We don't know whether it's problem gamblers have adapted or whether it's recreational gamblers are now coming in that wouldn't come into a smoky venue. Restricting advertising. Most European countries limit publicity and require informing the public about dangers, increasingly common in other countries. Actually, this is a fairly weak initiative. Small negligible impact on most people, two important exceptions. Problem gamblers report that advertising is a common trigger to gambling. In the field of alcohol and tobacco, advertising is known to promote youth involvement. So this is commonly targeted, but the reality is that advertising, and same results for tobacco and alcohol, they have relatively small impacts on behavior with these two exceptions. So it should still be done. The overall impact on the population is going to be small. Gambling venue design, Vegas-style design is believed to encourage gambling both by venue developers and by gamblers. However, very little evidence on whether it impacts actual gambling behavior. I think probably not. In that EGM revenue per machine is similar regardless of location. So in Alberta, the same machine revenue inside a bar versus a casino. And in Europe, the revenue per machine tends to be similar, whether it's in a hotel, on a ship, in a restaurant, etc. It's the machine more than the context. So there still may be something there, but it's not likely to be an important initiative. Increasing the cost of gambling, an effective policy for reducing harm associated with alcohol and tobacco. Does this really apply to gambling? The highest patronization actually occurs for lottery tickets with the lowest payback rate, and the lowest occurs for blackjack with the highest payback rate. But cost has a different meaning in the context of gambling. Perception of cost is more important than actual cost. People are tethered to the cost of playing relative to the possible rewards. That's why people prefer penny slots, cheap lottery tickets, and large jackpots. So, yeah, I think increasing the cost, the perception of cost, and this would be operationalized by a minimum bet size and a maximum win size, and that's how we could achieve the similar sort of benefits that we have for alcohol, tobacco. Government versus private provision, conflict of interest exists when the provider and regulator are part of the same organization. Theoretically, this conflict more likely to impede implementation of policies that interfere with revenues. However, in practice, responsible gambling measures are actually more common in jurisdictions with this conflict. So the government is the major beneficiary of gambling in Canada. Like, they get like 70% of all EGM revenue goes directly to provincial government. They get the lion's share of all gambling revenue with the exception of horse racing, which is not big in Canada. And you would think that would create a conflict of interest, and it does, but at the same time, they're more proactive than most countries in initiating responsible gambling initiatives and funding research to study these issues. Maybe it's their guilty conscience. That's fine. But further to this, in the alcohol field, monopolistic or government provision is associated with less harm to the public than privatization. So jurisdictions that are privatized alcohol sales, you tend to have more retailers so you have greater availability and greater variation in price, and so that greater availability leads to greater consumption. With greater consumption, you have that small portion of the population that have harm associated with that. So even though theoretically it doesn't make sense, monopolistic or government provision is probably a more sensible policy. Summary. Large arrays of initiatives exist, most relatively little direct empirical evidence about effectiveness. However, some evidence, most of these initiatives, and there's vast literature in other fields to guide. Most commonly implemented measures tend to be the least effective ones: awareness campaigns, employee training, EGM modifications. Furthermore, when potentially more effective measures implemented, like reduced EGMs, reduced hours, reductions too small to really have an effect. There's an unrealistic desire to implement effective prevention policies that not inconvenience non-problem gamblers or reduce revenues. When problem gamblers account for 1/3 to 40% of all revenues, if you're going to affect problem gambling rates, then you're going to lose some money. There's no way around it. Best practice number one that comes out of this literature review: recognize that effective problem gambling prevention will likely require some inconvenience to non-problem gamblers and some loss of revenue. Best practice number two: use a large array of educational policy initiatives. One of the overriding messages from this review is that there's nothing that's not useful to some extent. Same token, there's no silver bullets either. There's nothing that's by itself likely going to reduce harm to a great extent. And recognize that policy measures are equally, if not more important than educational initiatives. Coordinate these multiple initiatives. Offer these initiatives simultaneously rather than sequentially, and make sure the message does not conflict. I use the analogy of a shotgun blast. That's what you have to do. That the individual effect of any individual pellet is fairly minuscule unless combined with a bunch of other pellets target at the same thing, and then they have a synergistic effect. Decrease the general availability of gambling. This is a clear effective policy, and you can do that by limiting or reducing the number of casinos, EGM venues, limiting the number of gambling formats, keeping gambling venues away from vulnerable populations, restrict gambling opportunities, dedicated gambling venues, reduce hours of operation, eliminate or constrain high-risk forms of gambling. We know what those are, and these are some ways in which you could do it. Require pre-commitment. Eliminate reward cards, use them to foster responsible gambling. No reward points after a certain level of expenditure. Use data to proactively alert players to risky behavior. Restrict who's eligible to gamble. Introduce graduated ability to gamble independently, or raise the legal age. Restrict the use of tobacco and alcohol while gambling. Deters problem gamblers from gambling in the first place. Allows them to gamble without disinhibiting effects of alcohol. Restrict access to money while gambling. Gambling venues should not offer credit. ATMs should not be conveniently close. Impart knowledge, attitudes. I mean, you still need to do these educational things because they provide intellectual context for the policy initiatives. You should have comprehensive school-based programs, and you should have these adult-based initiatives. And last one, keep these initiatives in place for many years because population-wide behavioral change takes a long time. I mean, it took really 30 years before we saw an effect of attempts to reduce the harm associated with tobacco. Similarly for alcohol. Now, problem gambling rates are changing more quickly for gambling, so I see some efforts to mobilize these initiatives more quickly in these other fields, and so things may happen more quickly here, but still population-wide change takes a long time. And the evidentiary basis for everything I said here is contained in this report, contains all the studies up till 2012 that have addressed problem gambling initiatives. And that's all I got. Thank you.